After a year and a half in power, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, is getting more and more unpopular. Nothing he does seems to stop the slide. My guest here in London is the French MP, Alexander Holroyd, a member of the president's En Marche party. He has a seat on the Parliament's Finance Committee. How can the president boost his image ahead of crucial elections to the European Parliament next year? Alexander Holroyd, welcome to the Conflict Zone.
Thank you for having me.
You said last year that people voted for Emmanuel Macron because they were fed up with the two main parties. Well, they got fed up with him pretty quickly, didn't they? I mean, he got the worst slump of any new French leader in 20 years. That was within 3 months. Things haven't improved. In fact, the latest polls show him going down and down. Why is that?
Actually, that's not exactly accurate. The polls have gone up and have gone down again. Admittedly, they're down at the moment. I think
the latest poll this week by Cantar Public shows him falling a further 4 points between September and October.
Absolutely, but between the two, they went up and then they went down. To the surprise of everyone, over the first summer in September last year.
Only 26% now have confidence in him.
I think there's one element which is important. Is I think people voted for Emmanuel Macron for the new party because they didn't want political figures who were governing based on polls. And that's why they not only voted for Emmanuel Macron, but they voted for a crushing majority in Parliament. And those are unique elections. We want a new government, we want a new president, a new government and a new parliament who's capable of transforming the country independently of whether the polls go up and down. I think that one of the disasters that we've had in the last 20 years is that governments have had an eye to the polls more than to policy.
You're trying to tell me the polls don't matter. They do matter. They show his standing. And the party is getting pretty restless.
I don't think that we should, I just genuinely don't think that we should do policy making with an eye to the polls. If not, you will not do anything. The idea that by transforming a country and doing fundamental reforms, your poll will go up or down shouldn't matter. One should do what is good for the country. And that's what we're trying to do. And the French have voted for that.
One of your colleagues, MP, who's a founding member of En Marche, Stanislas Guerini, he said a few weeks ago, I'm one of the first to be irritated and exasperated by the blunders, but how do we bounce back? Not by changing direction. We need to reconnect with a very important founding principle of the party, empowering the people to make change happen. Reconnect? You're talking about after a year and a half having to reconnect with people because you've lost them within a year and a half? That's pretty unimpressive, isn't it?
Actually, Stanislas Guerini is not only one of my colleagues, but he is also one of the candidates to take the lead of the movement. I'm sure you'll know he announced his candidacy the day before yesterday, and I personally support him. I think it's absolutely true that as we're undertaking this profound transformation of every aspect of the way France has functioned, we need to do a better job at explaining what we're doing.
And what about a better job of keeping ministers happy? I mean, for instance, you know, you've lost 3 ministers in quick succession. This was before the reshuffle. Among them, the Environment Minister, Nicolas Hulot, who resigned on the radio, citing what he called an accumulation of disappointments. Then there was the Interior Minister, Gérard Collomb, who walked out after publicly rebuffing the president's appeals to stay there. Not a good sign. Public not happy, ministers not happy, party not happy.
Actually, the vast majority of the ministers are still in place. Nicolas Hulot left, it's true, out of a set of disappointments not only with government policy but also more generally with how the necessity of the transition, the environmental transition was going. And it's a very tricky issue. Listen, I won't deny it. There is, at the moment in France, a lot of discontent with, for instance, fuel prices. Because we've increased fuel prices, with the tax on fuel prices, in line with the carbon commitments of every presidential candidate. But we have to make a commitment. 3 weeks ago, we had disastrous floods in the south of France. We are having more, the climate change is having more and more impact on the daily lives of our citizens every day.
I understand that.
We need to take the policy concerns. Those might be unpopular, but it is an imperative that we drive through those reforms.
The problem for the president is one of style as much as substance, isn't it? I mean, the fact is he doesn't seem to like his own people very much. Last year, he declared France ungovernable. That didn't exactly endear him to the people. And in a similarly unflattering vein, he said the country was a society of entitlement and privileges. France isn't a reformable country, he said. Many have tried and they haven't succeeded. Pretty insulting, isn't it?
I just don't think that's accurate. The president...
French hate reform.
The president was elected by a majority of the French people and his majority in Parliament as well. And we've undertaken those reforms, and we've actually achieved some of those reforms that everybody said were impossible. Look at the labour market reform. The first reform, or the second reform that we did when we came into office. This was a reform which was perceived by everybody as impossible in France.
A lot of them were seen as benefiting the rich, weren't they?
Are we going back to that?
No, we'll come to that in a minute. It doesn't help the president, does it, when he blames the press? The press is being unfair to me. This is sort of leaf out of Donald Trump's playbook, isn't it?
I don't think it's a leaf out of Donald Trump's playbook. I'll tell you...
You kick the press out of the media room.
I'll give you an illustration.
Kick them out of the
I'll give you an illustration.
Yeah.
I'll give you an illustration. I was with the president in Denmark when he made one of those comments that was then decried in certain medias in France on the fact that France was difficult to reform. It was an open forum. He was talking to the French community abroad and to the Danish community who was there and present with the Danish Queen and the Danish Prime Minister. And it was a light-hearted comment which was not insulting in the least matter as if it had been said by anyone. It was taken out of context and distorted.
Is it light-hearted?
Is that very important? What's important is that we transform the country. What's important is that we achieve what we were elected to do.
And,
that's what we're
carry
100%
the people
committed
with
to.
You at the same time.
Which I said
he kicked the media out of the press room. Is that just on the flimsy excuse that he could find somewhere more comfortable with them? And then we had in July his comment, we have a press that no longer seeks the truth. We have a press that no longer seeks the truth. That is straight out of Donald Trump.
The portrayal of having kicked out the media of the press room is ludicrous. The media was in a room in the main palace of the Élysée, who is a small, undersized palace to host the presidency, and they've been moved literally 20 meters across the street, where a lot of the presidential staff is as well.
Since when did they care about whether the press had a comfortable place to lay their laptops?
Frankly, that is just inaccurate as a portrayal of what that gesture. There is no symbolic gesture behind it.
The press took it that way, though.
The press might have taken it that way, but there is none. They are still in the grounds where all the decisions are made.
We have a press that no longer seeks the truth. What's he saying? That it's just fake news?
I think he's saying
Is that the next thing he's going to talk about?
I think he's saying that we have arrived at a point, and actually I think this has been a problem in most elections in the past, where the media, a lot of people derive their media sources from unverified sources online. And actually one of the laws that we passed aims to curtail that trend, that phenomenon, which is undermining democracies through and through the Western world. But there is a genuine distrust in certain institutions, including the media, and I think one would be blind not to see it.
But it's always a bit lame when politicians blame the media for them being unpopular and say they're being unfair to us, and that's what he did.
No, I don't think so.
That's what underlines all that.
I think the quote you quoted from Stanislas Guérini recognises that we're completely aware that we are failing, so that we need to improve on certain aspects.
The complaint among associates past and present seems to be that even by French standards, Mr. Macron holds the reins of power very, very tightly. A small coterie of advisors surrounds him, and that's it. He doesn't explain, and he doesn't apologise, and he doesn't mind admitting that, does he? I make absolutely no apology for the verticality of power, he said. I am proud of the choices that are being made, and I hate the process that means you have to constantly explain the reasoning behind a decision. So much for accountability. He hates that vital democratic process of actually having to explain why he does what he does.
I think I'm
Are you happy with that? Are you comfortable with that?
I think it's great that you're asking the question, because I'm, to some extent, the perfect person to answer, because I'm the representative of, or I'm a representative of the other power, the legislative power.
I know you're the perfect person because that's why you're sitting there, but can you answer Can you answer? Are you happy with that attitude?
I can tell you that every law that the President has pushed for has been adopted after a thorough debate in Parliament, has been improved, amended, depending on the circumstances.
Sure, you have a massive majority. You have a solid majority.
Taking into account the comments of every opposition party. If you look at every law, nearly every single law, including the budget, there have been amendments accepted from every single opposition party
You're
in the
not
majority.
Addressing my point.
Which means that I am addressing your point.
No, you're not.
The President takes into account all the all the different parties in Parliament. On top of that, every main law that we've adopted has been preceded by months of consultation with all the different organisations, business organisations.
The process of having to explain. He said it. I hate the process of having to explain myself. Corinne Lepage, who was one of the first well-known politicians to join the Macron campaign, she sees a big gap between what was promised by President Macron and then what the public got. What I quickly found embarrassing, she said, is the contradiction between the bottom-up approach that was promised and sold to the French and the reality. Democratic socialism the Soviet way, completely vertical and also very masculine. In other words, Macron in office is not the person he promised to be before he got there.
I understand the quote. I disagree with that assessment completely. And actually, if you take the commitments that we made, the program that we made, manifesto that we made, and you take it line by line, you will see that we are putting in place precisely what we said we would put in place.
What about on unemployment?
That is a big difference from what was done in the past, where things were said during the campaign and were then not achieved during the presidency. We have committed to one thing. We've written a program. It's articulated precisely what we will do. And we are going for this program and implementing what the French have voted for.
What about unemployment? It's one of the highest rates in the EU at around 9%. Shouldn't that have been the first priority?
That is a very important priority. That's actually an essential priority. Most of our program is aimed in part at challenging that, which it's more than a problem. It has been a chronicle problem of France for the last 30 years. The idea that we would undo or that we would redo all this transformation in a year and a half after 20 years of immobilism is ludicrous.
But you take the Pays de la Loire, for example, the region around Nantes, some of the lowest unemployment rates in France, but 9 out of 10 of the job offers are for fixed-term contracts. 3/4 of those jobs are for less than a month, and 30% are only for 1 day. And that's not addressing the problem of unemployment in France, is it?
If you're saying that we have a structural problem with unemployment, I can't agree more. We have a particular problem in France, is we have a mismatch between the demand and the skills necessary to fulfill that demand. We actually have 42 to 45% of businesses who agree that there are tensions on the labour market to recruit. Yet in regions where we have unemployment, which sometimes is around 10, 15%, 20, 25% amongst the youth.
Mr.
So
Holroyd,
that's why we've invested enormously in a great law for traineeship and skills.
Mr. Holroyd, the fear from your point of view has to be that you're facing this serious unpopularity of the president ahead of European elections next year, with Marine Le Pen's far-right party pretty much neck and neck with yours. Mr. Macron has already warned about a civil war in Europe between liberal and illiberal parties. But if he can't fight that battle successfully at home, it won't give him much authority to fight it in Europe, will it?
He said that there is an atmosphere which is akin to a kind of civil war. And I think that it is true today that divisions across actually most member states are being felt more than they were in, say, the 90s or the 2000s. Now, the European election is a European election. It's an election about Europe and where Europe goes.
My point is that he has drawn the battle lines in Europe. Liberal democracies against what he likes to call illiberal democracies. But they're not winning, are they?
I think there is a point.
He's not winning this battle. He's not winning this battle already. Look at Poland. Look at Hungary. Look at the toothless institutions of the EU trying to have disciplinary processes against these two countries and failing miserably to change their policies in any way whatsoever.
Actually, the interesting
this is a battle that Europe is losing now. Mr. Macron is fighting a losing battle himself.
I think the president, but also the whole party, accept that there is today a growing interest in illiberal democracies. And we think that part of that is because there is an assessment made by a lot of our citizens that our democracy, our European Union, our states have been unable to address some of the daily concerns of their lives. And the only way to address that issue is to change that in the flesh, in the fact, which is why we've proposed a whole series of changes to the European Union, which is a program for the European Union that we will defend in the European elections with people who will defend a similar program everywhere in Europe.
Which half of Europe doesn't want. Your president says we need a sovereignty that is stronger than just our own, which complements but doesn't replace it. Who wants that?
Actually,
Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Italians, they don't want it.
Actually,
they don't want any of that.
There are two things.
More rules, Who do you think is winning this civil war? You look at the difference between the support for Italy's leaders at the moment. It's far-right, anti-establishment government, which is running at over 60% support. And how much support is your president getting in the mid-20s?
Actually, you look at the support for the European Union.
Which way is Europe going?
You look at the support for the European Union in Poland, for instance, and it's amongst the highest in Europe. In Poland, among citizens. So the reflection that because of a certain government is elected nationally, it reflects the views of Europe of its citizens is a false one. You look in Austria, same phenomenon. And secondly, there's a lot of aspects of that program that have been welcomed by Germany on the Eurozone, by Germany on the Eurozone, by Ireland, by our partners in Sweden.
Mr. Holroyd, you say that, but a new survey last month of European attitudes by Friends of Europe found that almost half the respondents believed the EU was irrelevant. 64% were not convinced that their lives would be any worse without the EU. And in France itself, your country, 41% thought life would be just the same without the EU, and only 22% thought it would be worse. That is hardly the kind of encouragement for Mr. Macron's grand project that you're claiming.
I mean, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that poll, so I'm not going to comment on it yet. But I'm not sure what the perimeter is. But there is a regular poll, a Eurobarometer poll, about attitudes and intentions towards the EU, and you will see that in countries which have governments which have been relatively hostile to the EU, to the institutions as they stand, the population doesn't always follow. There is a separation between national politics and European politics. They're not the same thing. You're not voting for the same responsibilities. It's very simple.
What the polls are showing is that for this greater integration that your president is pushing for, this greater cooperation, there's no market for that.
Actually,
there's no
that's a very interesting thing. I'm curious to see, but for instance, the president has offered to or suggested that we should reinforce Frontex, the border agency of Europe, by 10,000 men. Those kinds of measures are supported by most people. That we should have a European asylum agency. They're supported by a significant amount of member states.
What is not supported is the way that you are treating immigrants at the moment. In April, a group of UN human rights experts warned about what they called inhuman conditions for migrants along your northern coast and increasingly regressive policies in France. That's the effect of your new immigration law passed in April, isn't it? You shortened the deadlines for asylum applications, you doubled the time for which illegal migrants can be detained, and you introduced a one-year prison sentence for entering France illegally. And your president says he wants a more humane approach to immigration. Through these measures, thoroughly condemned, incidentally, by human rights groups, including the UN.
That is a partisan reading of the bill. We have actually in France one of the most generous. We have one of the most generous systems.
Talk to the human rights groups.
We have one of the most generous system in terms of acceding to citizenship. What the president has said is that we need to increase efficiency of procedures, in great part to be more human. We have people in France who wait for 10 years to have a decision made on whether they have a right to asylum claim or not. That's unacceptable, which is why in this budget, for instance, we're investing much more in all those different aspects, choosing whether somebody has, or deciding, making the arbitration whether somebody has the right to refugee status or not, then investing enormously into those people who have the right to refugee status, so that they can integrate society much quicker. All of this is articulated not only in that bill, but also in the budget. And those are things that we are happy to defend.
The reality, Mr. Holroyd, is very different. According to Médecins Sans Frontières, the practice is to return migrants who cross into France from Italy, including unaccompanied children, with no thought for their safety or for France's duty to offer them protection. That is why earlier in the year, the administrative tribunal in Nice ruled these practices illegal and suspended the refusal of entry decisions against 19 minors. Your courts are having to do what your government should have done in the first place, which is enforce a just and fair system for these migrants, particularly the most vulnerable ones, the children. Your courts had to step in to tell the government, this is wrong. Your refusal of entry to these people is illegal.
Actually, that is precisely what we're doing, and that is precisely what that law aims to do. It's precisely that law aims to make a decision.
That's a good way of trying to spin what your authorities are doing, which is breaking the law and breaking their...
There is no spin. There is no spin. There is a desire to have more clarity, to be able to be more human and efficient in the treatment of immigration. And that includes investing in those who have a right to stay in France and ensuring that those who don't have a right can return to their home countries.
Mr. Holroyd,
and that goes through a mixture of European cooperation and domestic policy. both of which, in the European side, we're advocating, in the French side, we're investing in.
According to Médecins Sans Frontières, between June 24th and 26th, 157 people were returned to Italy without even the opportunity to apply for asylum. 76 of them were detained for 14 hours. 11 minors were illegally returned to Italy, then escorted once again back to France by the Italian police. These people are being treated like cattle on your border and by your authorities.
That's absolutely untrue. If you look at the last arrival...
So Médecins Sans Frontières made this up,
if you look at the arrivals...
Did they make this up?
If you look at the arrivals in France, for instance,
These
the
are
Aquarius,
facts.
who've been welcomed from
These
Spain,
are facts.
we have been the second country to welcome those immigrants. So those are facts as well.
Let's move on to the other contentious subject, which of course is Brexit. There seems to have been a sense in France that this was really just a British problem and France could get perhaps some profit out of it, but that's changing now, isn't it? It's not just a question of wanting Britain to suffer, although Mr. Macron suggested that he thought they should suffer, didn't he?
No.
He said, Brexit shows us one thing. It's not easy to exit the European Union, not without cost, not without consequences.
Is that false?
Well, the suggestion is that he wanted Britain to pay that cost.
No, the suggestion that it's a matter of fact.
He wanted to pay a cost.
Leaving the EU is a complicated process. I don't think that anybody on either side of the channel would deny that. Do you know? Do you know anybody who would actually say that the process of leaving the EU is an easy one?
Well, actually, some people in this country, in Britain, certainly said it was an easy one, but they've been proved wrong. Do you believe in a last-minute deal, the two sides taking it right down to the wire just to show that they've extracted all the concessions from the others?
I'd just like to make a point. There is no one, including the president in France, who thinks that Brexit is a good thing.
But there is a strong feeling in London that the French wanted maximum uncertainty for as long as possible, for one thing, to try and persuade British-based finance houses into moving into continental Europe.
No, we've been very, very clear from the get-go about what was important to France. We've just talked about Europe. We consider that the European single market is the future of our economy. We were very clear there is one key red line, which is any deal cannot undermine that single market.
My question was, do you believe in a last-minute deal? Because it seems that Monsieur Barnier is softening some of his positions on Northern Ireland and on financial services.
I think we should do everything in our power to find a deal. I think not having a deal would be, if not disastrous, at least very hurtful for both parties. So I think we should work absolutely consistently with one objective in head, to find a deal. But that deal cannot come at any price. It doesn't come at the price of undermining the single market.
But attitudes are changing. The position of the EU is softening now, isn't it?
I mean, that's a question for Michel Barnier. I'm not into the negotiations day to day. I'm a French parliamentarian, so I'm not a negotiator for the EU. But what I've always said, and what I will stick by, is that we need to find a deal. Absolutely. It is the priority. And it's actually the priority which has been articulated by the 27 leaders of the Council at every step of the way. But that deal cannot come at any cost. That deal can't undermine the EU, the project that we've taken 67 years or 60 or 70 years to build.
You're talking about a rule-based system.
I'm talking about a rule-based system. I'm talking about a single market, which works in one way.
And you ignore the rules when you feel like it, and you apply them when you feel like it. It's very selective, isn't it? It's very selective.
No.
As Jean-Claude Juncker said in 2016, when he was giving France a free pass over one of the budget targets that it had missed, why was he doing that? Because it's France, he said. Because it's France. That's the attitude to rules. You enforce them when you want, and you enforce them very selectively when you want.
That's actually inaccurate. If you look at the Commission's comments on France's budgets, which I suppose is what you're talking about.
I was talking about 2016 when he said it.
No, but actually,
I was talking about 2016.
Not even 2016.
The quote is accurate.
The quote is accurate. No, but I mean the assessment way. We have a commission who is supposed to enforce the rules. That commission, on every occasion that it's had to, which is called the European semester when it comments on different budget, has always criticised in the last 10 years France's budget for our excesses. And I recognise that.
It's criticised it, but it's done nothing about it.
It's
criticised, but it's done nothing about it.
I completely recognise it. I recognise that.
That's why I said,
which is why when we...
The rules are enforced selectively.
Which is why, when we were elected, we did, in our first budget, every effort to come out of the excessive defective deficit procedure, which we have succeeded in doing. So I am absolutely conscious that in the terms of fiscal policy, the excessive budgets that France has driven through for the last 8 years have undermined to some extent the rules. So have, for instance, the excessive budgets that Germany had in 2005 or the excessive trade balance that Germany has today in the eyes of the Commission and of the treaty.
All right.
The Commission does its role. It enforces the treaties. If it's at the margin, it has a leeway, which is inscribed in the treaty. If it is not at the margin, then it must take action.
It comments,
which is up to the Commission,
comments
really.
on the violations. I'd question whether it actually enforces them, the rules. Thank you. Mr. Alexander Holroyd.
Thank you for having me.
Conflict Zone. Thank you very much indeed.